leaving, going to prison, and then later on, we're coming back. And I'm like, weren't you just here a few months ago? You went to prison. What are you doing back? But
Mm,
it's one of those things. And the majority of those people that were coming back, they were sentenced, either over sentenced or illegally sentenced or something, and were coming back for a new sentence hearing. So it's like, in order to get this court system to work efficiently, it's like a three-way juggling act between the court's docket, the defense schedule, and the prosecutor's schedule, because all of those guys have different cases to deal with. You're not their only one. So timing and scheduling and planning and preparation, and they, by the way, they continue to investigate this ongoing while you're waiting just to set foot in the courtroom to start a trial. So it's one of those processes where, as we see crime on the rise, prosecutors want bigger budgets, defense counsel's offices need bigger budgets. And we've just overloaded the system to the point that you can go to jail for trespassing. And if you're not allowed to bond or something like that, you may actually sit there for 30 days waiting to get before a judge. And sometimes your arraignment may be delayed. And that's one thing they do differently in Pinellas County. When you're arrested and charged, they do what's called a first notice hearing, where basically you're just brought before the court. Sometimes they do it electronically, audio and video from the jail, and they just read you the charges just to make you aware of things. And then after that, you don't say nothing, no plea or anything. You go on back to your cell and wait for the next hearing or a court date again. But that's really what drags out that process a lot, and that portion of the process with me here. I don't know why it took a year and a half to get to sentencing, but that was very short, quick, and fast. And after that hearing was over, I'm handcuffed, put in a wheelchair, and wheeled back to my pod. And then 3 days later, I'm transferred to DOC.
I mean, one thing that's unique about what you're saying is, for people to keep in mind, a capital case is far different than another case. A case where death penalty is going to be recommended it takes longer. It's far more expensive. It requires a substantial amount of resources and investment of time with everybody involved. So a capital case is in its own category. And for many states, you've got a unanimous jury vote that's required to sentence someone to death. That's another piece about what you were sharing, that with Florida, they went through stages. I mean, you were sentenced to death on a 7-5 jury vote. That's a majority, but it's not a super majority, and it's certainly not unanimous.
Fair
Like
majority.
you said, not long after that, it was changed to 8-2, and then it was changed to unanimous. And now part of the debate in Florida, like you alluded to, is to change that back, to lower that threshold from unanimous to, I'm not sure what it would be from 8-4.
Well, originally what they changed it to was 10-2.
10-2.
And then they went to unanimous. And now in this new legislation with the session in progress right now, that's what the governor's pushing for. The 8-2 is what I read. As far as this whole process like that and how it all unfolds for you, it's really one of those things where you're on the outside looking in, so to speak, because everybody outside there, including your family, your attorneys, and your investigators, they're doing all this stuff. You're behind these walls and bars. You don't see, hear, or know nothing until somebody comes to tell you. But the whole thing about what this U.S. Supreme Court decided was, and it was basically an Eighth Amendment violation, where they thought that what the judge was doing is what the jury was supposed to be doing. And then the whole process of being unanimous or a bare majority or super majority came into play. And I think finally everybody just settled on unanimity. But what the Florida Supreme Court came back and rescinded from was their further review of the Eighth Amendment that actually does not specifically require jurors be unanimous in recommending a sentence of death. It's just something we never put in the law,
Ron, just in what you shared from this story, I mean, I think of the word Byzantine or complex or complicated or convoluted. I mean, to even just narrate what you shared requires explanation upon explanation and stating these individuals. And to your point, you're in the dark on a lot of this, while you as an individual are there, and you have individuals both advocating for you and advocating against you, largely out of your control. And the system is swirling around, doing its thing while you were there, and in a way, a lot of ways helpless. But these are just the steps that we've talked about to get you convicted. And it's a whole nother chapter. You've talked about a bit of this exoneration. I want to go back to the evidence piece. You said this a little bit earlier. What evidence was used to convict you?
Well, that's the problem with my case. It was what is called a wholly circumstantial case. Means there is no evidence. Now, what the prosecution is going to do is kind of akin to the way writers, producers, and directors put a TV show together. All this stuff in the background, they come together to tell you a story. And it was their story that convicted me. What they did was a masterful job of assassinating my character and insulting my integrity. You have to become the bad guy, the villain, the antichrist, all of this in that jury's minds so that they will vote guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really what it was. There was some physical pieces of evidence that turned out to be pretty much in my favor, like this glove that they had and some DNA testimony that I found out about. But there really was no evidence. There was more evidence for me than there was against me.
Mm-hmm. There were no eyewitnesses. There was
Correct.
no DNA evidence other than, and no evidence other than a story connecting you to this crime.
Well, see, they tried to use DNA in their story because of the paternal connection between me and one of the victims, but it was a mixture of DNA. And the whole thing came down to determining whether or not some of that mixture was from the child victim or from the father murderer, you see. And one of the things that I will share with you, I remember hearing in a lot of our pretrial hearings, which were numerous over this period of time, is the judge reminding the prosecutors, you know, Mr. So-and-so, Mr. Martin, death is different. And I remember him saying that over and over and over again. It's like, you know, death is different. He's entitled to this. He's got a right to this. And I'll tell you this that happened. It really blew my mind. We were in court one day on a hearing for a motion to hire our own DNA expert. My attorneys went out and found a private DNA lab out in Texas, I believe, that the state attorney's office used extensively several times over years of worth of time. Do you know the prosecutor stood there and objected to us using the same lab they had used so many times for so long a time? They were objecting to that. So we had to go out. They found another lab, one out of Ohio, and we ended up working with them. But it's these kind of little things, like you said, all these little nuances that, you know, the state gets to come in, argue against you, and the whole thing, which should have been a 15-minute, yep, he got a right to that, he can do it, ordered. Instead, it gets drug out into who knows how much over how much longer, and it's just delaying it, you know, before you ever get to the point where, you know, you file a motion to exclude something the state wants to bring in, or to bring in something the state doesn't want to have brought in. And it's like they're arguing over whether or not the jury should hear the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, like we swear every human being to do as they enter that courtroom to testify.
Right.
And I thought, how can justice be real, true, and genuine when they're wanting to exclude something because it's potentially exculpatory for me, and include something that has absolutely zero evidentiary value whatsoever? And I'll give you an example of that. They played a videotape of both victims at the beach one day. That video was made more than about a week or so prior to the murders happening. So there was no way, and I wasn't in it, I wasn't involved in it, but there was nothing about that video that could have proved me guilty or innocent. Zero probative value whatsoever. We wanted to have it excluded, and then comes all these discussions about, well, it's just going to inflame the jury. It's going to make them want to hold somebody responsible. There's no evidentiary value to it. Ultimately, the judge decided to allow it. And what the prosecution did with it, especially in the closing arguments, they played that video, big screen right in front of the jury, and then froze it right on a picture of the child victim while he's giving his closing remark. Members of the jury could visibly be seen crying. I myself was brought to tears over that, so I can't blame them. But like I said, the video could not have proved me innocent nor guilty in any manner, shape, or form whatsoever. So it's little things like that that get into putting the trial on, that drag it out so much that it's like, my God, how, there were other things we wanted to have brought in. I won't belabor all of that, but it was just surprising to me how we're arguing over whether or not the jury should hear the whole story,
Right.
especially when it's directly relevant to the parties involved.
Wow.
And the judge decides to exclude it,
You said that you heard people say often that death is different, meaning this kind of case, this kind of sentence. And
No,
the
that was
first
the
thing,
court. That was the trial judge reminding the prosecutor,
and that's
different little.
true in
It
every
is.
way, right? This case, this process is different. I mean, when you said that, the first thing that I thought of is within the Old Testament, there's a threshold and a requirement of two witnesses, if we're talking ancient Israel, in order to bring or sentence someone to death. I mean, that's an ancient truth, and other cultures share something similar. And yet here we are within the United States, we obviously within living memory for all those who likely here right now. And yet the threshold to bring you this death sentence involved wholly circumstantial evidence, as you said. I mean, maybe this question is rhetorical, Ron, but how does something like that happen? How does someone like you get in a position like that without this physical connecting evidence?
Well, it's funny you make the connection between the Old Testament and ancient Israel. I've read a little bit about that, and I'm familiar with how it was with the Hebrews. We are doing the same thing a lot of them did then. God gave his word, his commandments, and his laws for them, right? Well, we decided our own. And it's the same way in our, criminal justice system here. And if you hear a lot, from people talking about judges shouldn't legislate from the bench, and then there's all this interpretation of the law, it means this, doesn't mean that, and whatnot. We are deciding for ourselves what we want. And the prosecutor wants to win. Of course, the defense wants to win. Right. And it's become a society of we resort to whatever tactics and efforts and opportunities we can to win, because that's ultimately what they're there for.
Can you talk some about your time on death row and what made that different than your time in jail before that actual sentence came out? I know one thing I've heard you say in other spaces is that you believe when you left that there were those on death row who were innocent. So I know there's that piece as well, but with that experience, how was that exceptional or different than being in jail before?
Well, here's the thing. When I left death row, my biggest concern and curiosity, not that there were others that I know were innocent, but how many of these other 300 and some people back here might be just as innocent as I am? And I felt really fortunate, really blessed that my case was heard and the Supreme Court ruled correctly in this case. But it just has how can it not beg the question, how many more of those guys really are innocent too? Especially when I look at, which is something I didn't learn until later on, how we've had so many exonerations, not just in this country, but in the worst state of all, my home state of Florida. And you're correct. I became number 27 of now 30 people where we have recognized we were wrong. And it makes me sit and wonder every time, how can we get something wrong like this and be this wrong at it?
And that often.
Yeah, Florida alone, 30 times. Right. And I'll tell you the big story that really I like to share with people about this. The first day of my trial, it's the jury selection phase. They've got 120 people. They divide them into two groups, and then each group gets a chance to come in and be weeded through like that. But the first thing the judge does is gives everybody an opportunity to express to the court why they should be excluded from being a juror in this particular trial. Well, one lady stood up and she said, I guess previously she had lived up north in the New England area somewhere, and she served on a jury duty. It was a murder case and they were seeking the death penalty. She said, we voted to convict this man, and then we voted for the death penalty. Well, in the process of time, that death sentence was carried out, over and done with, right? Wrong. They later discovered the actual perpetrator of the murders, confessed to it all. Her reason that she was articulating to be excused was because they were wrong and she never wanted to be a part of anything like that ever again. That was the day, even after 4 years, everything really hit me, and I mean hit me hard. I'm sitting there at that table listening to this poor woman, feeling my stomach somewhere down around my ankles about then. And I sat there thinking to myself, oh my God, this could actually happen to me.
So what were, you said a little earlier, the events that led to your exoneration? Where did that process begin, and how much advocacy did that require on your part from being within prison to the advocacy of those on the outside working together?
It begins from the time that the adjudication is entered into the record. It actually triggers that appellate process because it's a death sentence case. It's got to go before the Florida Supreme Court, regardless of what the court ruled there. We actually filed 2 motions for a, what was it? Motion to, I'm drawing a blank here, renew the motion for the judgment of acquittal. They brought me back. I sat in that courtroom, heard all of this, judge denied it again. So now we focus on the appellate phase, which is the Florida Supreme Court. Now I'm assigned a public defender. It was an attorney out of the 10th Judicial Circuit down in Bartow, Florida. And she did come to visit with me. We had phone calls. We talked about things. And, I think I helped her. My role in it really is to try to help her help me by sharing with her what I remember from the trial. She's got the whole record, the whole transcript, plus access to my defense attorneys. But I think the one thing that I shared with her that stood out to me was, it was one of the hearings where we were talking about hiring our own DNA expert to do the same DNA analysis. And I remember standing at the podium right next to my attorney, the prosecutor, telling the judge, Your Honor, I don't know why the defense wants to retest all of this stuff that has already excluded the defendant. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but I've been a cop long enough to know what that means and understand it. And I'm sitting there, I turn my head, look at my attorney. I'm like, excluded the defendant? What am I doing here? It was like, what's going on in here? What are you talking about? Well, what I would come to find out is that's part of that process where all these other little moving pieces have to fall into place, only they're moving in 1,000 different directions at probably 100 miles an hour, So there's going to be some time lag in that and some delays and whatnot. But more to your point, the point in your question, though, in this process, like I said, you're basically on the outside looking in. So I'm trying to, remember things. I've got some things that I'm reviewing and going through. I get a copy of the briefs that were filed by my defense attorney and by the state assistant attorney general. And I read through and review that. And really that's basically what you're limited to, other than, I spend a lot of my time studying biblical doctrine and studying case law and other stuff just to learn more of this whole legal thing that I did not know or be aware of yet. But, yeah, that's basically where you're at. You're trying to figure out ways to pass the time or see if there's maybe something you can do to help your case, or, perhaps learn of some other case law or precedent that might be something for you to look into that might be helpful. And that's about it. Otherwise, you're sitting and waiting, really.
I want to give people a small vision of some of those rhythms on death row, especially since Florida's is so large. I mean, what were the daily rhythms for you there? How are those the same or different over the years? What did daily life look like? You were in a single cell, 6x9. I know that.
Right. They talk a lot about it being solitary confinement. The definition of that on death row is you're the only one in that cell by yourself. I got a row of 17 cells. So there's bars in the front. I can hear these people. Some of them like to hold their mirrors out of the bars and be able to see other things, people coming down the row, but you are interacting with these other inmates. Every day, the same routine. They bring breakfast in the morning. Then later on, you get up, get dressed, get your room made because you had to be in, decent order and everything throughout the business day. Lunch comes, same thing after that, clean up, they take everything back. Then evening meal, and then there's a shift change for the staff. And then after that, cooling out for the rest of the night. The only exception was if you happen to have an appointment to go out to that they would come and let you know about, or if you ordered commissary, they would, the day when those comes, everybody loves those. That's like Christmas every week in prison. But the only other thing was having a visitation or deciding to go out on the rec yard. Now, we were afforded 3 hours a day on the rec yard for 2 days a week. And it would either be 3 hours in the morning or 3 hours in the afternoon. It was depending on their staffing and whatnot. The process for that is after breakfast and everything, one officer comes around and you have to verbally tell them you want to go to rec that day. So they put you on the list. They do that so they make sure that if one inmate can't be around another one, or there's a keep separate issue there, and they know how many are going, because that determines how many officers they have to have for that. They all got to be searched and all this, taken down to the rec yard, then they got to be monitored while they're there on the rec yard. And it's 3 solid hours straight. You know, if you want to change your mind, go back inside, you down there till rec is over. And I think the only other thing was showers. We were allowed showers on Tuesdays and Thursdays, which were our 2 rec days, meaning you go outside, get all hot and sweaty and musty. Yeah, come back in, take a shower. And that was basically typically the routine. In fact, it was a day we were supposed to go to rec when I was supposed to be released. And that was when I got the second shock of my life.
Once you were released, what did life look like in those early stages? I know often the focus is on community and on housing and on a job, and those are pretty immediate concerns, but it's been some years since then. But what were those immediate days and weeks like for you?
I was rather fortunate to have a very loving and supportive family, including 2 sisters that came to visit me, along with some others from time to time when they could. But for me, I'm divorced now. You know, my wife and kids think I'm some serious murderer or something. I've lost the home we built together. My military career is over. They discharged me under what's called an other than honorable discharge. And that happened before I went to trial and was convicted of doing anything wrong. Of course, at that point, you don't have a job. You know, you haven't worked for anybody for the last 8.5 years. So all I'm really thinking about is my sister had me come live with her. She's the one who picked me up that day I was released. And she had one of her rooms set up for me and had already gotten a cell phone and had that service set up. And, you know, she basically had me ready to get out of there. And she told me, look, I want you to just take a couple months. Don't worry about trying to help with the bills or paying any rent or anything. Just take a couple of months, sit still, get used to being home, get used to being out. I said, Sharon, baby, I appreciate that, but I can't. I just spent 8.5 years sitting still, looking at the same walls and ceiling. So when I had a little bit of money, you know, I got on the city bus, which fortunately came through her neighborhood, and I'd go into Kissimmee, into Orlando, and, you know, I'm applying for jobs and everything. And, you know, looking around, seeing how so much has changed in 8 years, that was kind of surprising and blowing my mind. I even found out they had a new Sunrail system in place, a train, you know, running through the 3 central Florida county areas. I went out and rode that Sunrail train just to see where it went and what that was all about. I'd never heard of it before. But eventually, and it was something I was thinking about the day we were coming home, because, you know, I have a Class A CDL driver's license. I was a truck driver as well. And I was thinking about renewing my license, and could I get back to work? You know, I'm not one of these guys to couch surf and sit around, eat up everybody else's food, run their bills up. And I'm a grown man. I'm supposed to be in my own place, on my own 2 feet, supporting myself and developing a way to be able to help and support others. So we made 2 stops on the way home from the prison. One was a 7-Eleven just to get something to drink. I wanted something other than that juice they've been giving us. And the second one was to a Florida Division of Driver's License office, so I could ask about renewing my driver's license, since it's a Class A commercial driver's license, you know. But I ended up, I think it was probably at about a month or so, I ended up working for the first private owner operators driving a truck for them. It was very easy to go down and renew my license. And I worked for like 2 or 3 of those guys, and then decided I need to go back to a company, something more solid and stable, primarily because I found out about entertainment transportation that I really was interested in. So these guys that own their own trucks weren't doing that. So like I am today out here on a tour with the famous country artist, that's what I've been doing since 2019. But other than that, there were some hiccups. I found out hurdles I had to overcome because of these convictions, even though the convictions were judgments were reversed. Essentially, it's like they never happened. If you look me up on the Florida Department of Corrections website, can't find me. They don't even list me as a released inmate because the conviction was never final. You see what I mean? So what I did is the tour I was on at the time was with Darius Rucker and Hootie and the Blowfish, and we had to go into Canada to do a show. That requires having a passport, which I was able to get, and you got to make sure that crossing that border ain't going to be a problem. Well, I crossed the border and they turned me around. I was actually turning around anyway, but what we found out at the time is that 2 charges, so 2 separate convictions, but they were reported differently. One showed exonerated and acquitted, the other didn't. So I had to get back in touch with my attorneys, and they were able to fix that very quickly and easily. But beside that, I think short of trying to get back into being a law enforcement officer again and go to work for the sheriff's office or some police department, it's really been somewhat of a little bit of a smoother ride, so to speak, for me, because I don't have a criminal felony history or anything to worry about. Actually, I've also regained my Florida concealed firearms license now, so I can own and possess a firearm. Since my conviction was never final, my rights were really never lost to me. And I did get a letter to say, I was supposed to go to jury duty once. And I knew up front, there's a prosecutor on planet Earth that's going to want me on a jury. Right. So I called down there because I'm on the road working and I really didn't want to do jury duty anyway. And I talked to her about that and I told her the whole story, the truth. She's like, oh, yeah, you never had your rights restored. No, ma'am. Is there yeah, there's a process you got to go through. I haven't been through it. Yeah, we're going to take you off. You can't be on a jury. Okay, yes, ma'am. Thank you. And hung up the phone, But yeah, it's been, since then things have gotten much better. I'm dating now. I'm living in a home that I'm leasing and out here, some would say living the dream, rubbing artists with these class A, A-list celebrities and famous artists and whatnot. Right. But other than that, like I said, I consider myself one of the more blessed and fortunate ones. I like to get off the road and not be out traveling all the time like this. Yeah. But then again, that was one of the professions that I was experienced and trained in. So that's what I resorted to.
I mean, in one sense, Ron, it makes me so thankful hearing just in ways how life is settled, how things have kind of come back into some of the rhythms before, and that's incredible. And in another sense, I'm grieved even that has to be a thought. And then I also think about, this is essentially a lost decade of your life that happened with this and this entire process, and the measuring that is incalculable. And for you, you were innocent, much less for individuals who come out of the system and who were guilty and bear on them this weight in a different way in what many call a civic death of coming out with a sentence and with the charge, and that hanging over and affecting all aspects of your life. Well, what does your work in the advocacy spaces look like now? And also want to remind people, I see some questions coming in. If anybody wants to ask anything, I'll turn to that Q&A in a second. But what does your advocacy work look like now, either on your own and or through Witness to Innocence? And talk a little about that.
My biggest goal right now in sharing my story is trying to enlighten people about the truth behind capital punishment. And you alluded to this in the beginning when you mentioned how so many people just don't know, they're not aware of this. We're a society where when it comes to the death penalty, say you see the story, the news on the 6 o'clock news. Well, by 6 o'clock in the morning, your mind is on to some other things, getting ready. You've forgotten about that 6 o'clock newscast. So unless the death penalty has crossed your path, directly or somehow closely indirectly, it's really not something a lot of people are concerned about. And me personally, I used to be one of them. Even as a sheriff's deputy out here arresting people and charging them with crimes, I was never for or against capital punishment. And I often tell people, unless I got called to testify in court, my involvement in that case ended the moment I cleared central booking, because I had to get back out there to answer more calls and, keep doing my job. I wasn't one of the guys that followed up with how many convictions came out of my arrest or how many man years were handed out to people. That wasn't me. So I think our biggest hurdle right now is awareness. The second biggest problem is the misperceptions and misconceptions about capital punishment that I think comes from the quote unquote bandwagon effect, because either someone's religious position on it or someone's political position on it. Ultimately, I think that if people knew the full truth behind capital punishment, both before, during, and after, I think they'd advocate for abolishing death penalty and capital punishment as well, because it's just something where it's not serving us. And that's what I'm trying to impress upon people. If you hear and there's some people I'd love to be able to sit down and talk with privately, like family members and relatives of murder victims. One in particular in Orlando, I'd love to be able to talk to, but we'll say that for another time. But that's really what we're doing. We're trying to let people know, hey, we're not screaming, this is what they did to me. They did me wrong. They didn't compensate me all. No, we're trying to let people know, here's the real truth behind capital punishment. And I do the speaking events I do simply because I know there's things a lot of people don't know. I know it's all public record. They can go read up on me and read the internet and all that, but you're not going to get the whole story.
Right.
There in one single mention in any of them news reports or news articles on the internet that can tell you what's actually in the black and white record and all those pre-trial hearings that preceded the trial. So being able to let people talk to me, ask me questions, and, I read this in the news. Could you do? Well, sure, I'll talk about that. That's what I'm here for. But there's just so many that it's not of interest to them. Hasn't crossed their path, so it's not affecting them. And by virtue of that, when these things come up in the legislature for these laws to be voted on, passed, or rescinded, most people, well, God said an eye for an eye, kill them all. Other people, every life has value. Thou shalt not kill, life without parole. And that's the end of it for a lot of people.
Wow. I mean, I'm thinking about the video series that Version Unite and Witness to Innocence helped put out, that it could happen to you. And I might put those in the email that we send out. But the point of those videos is emphasizing this is something that can happen to other individuals. What happened to you was unexpected and was
never saw it coming.
Yeah, didn't see it coming, and unfortunately not wholly exceptional, right? There's 30 exonerations in Florida, 190 nationally. We factor that in to how many people that we've had on and go through death row. That's a failure rate of at least 10% or so. Now, one question that came in that someone mentioned, you alluded to this, was asking about any kind of compensation that came as a result of this, any kind of recompense, whether that be the state admitting that it was at fault, other than obviously you being exonerated, or any kind of compensation that came from the state to work to atone for this.
Well, in the state of Florida, the fact that the highest court in the state ruled unanimously that I was not guilty and they voted to acquit me means absolutely nothing. Florida does have a compensation statute on the books. It's called Victims of Wrongful Incarceration. I think it's being reviewed again and revised in this particular session this year. The reason I was not compensated is because there's some requirements in this law now. First thing is you have to file a petition with the original sentencing court and do it within 90 days. First of all, that means the same judge who just so long ago voted to, not voted, but I'm sorry, adjudicated me guilty, has now been ordered by the state Supreme Court to adjudicate me not guilty, must now get this petition because he has to make a ruling and determine if in fact I am a victim of wrongful incarceration. So and what that does is it triggers that adversarial process all over
Mhm,
again.
mhm.
The state's going to come in and they get to basically I go on trial all over again.
Right.
Well, what the statute also requires me to do is what we call shifting the burden. The state has the burden of proving you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, the state requires me to produce what's called evidence of actual innocence.
Mhm,
If I had that, I'd have never spent a day in jail.
mhm,
Well,
mhm.
because, I wasn't involved in this thing, I had nothing to do with it. Everything they know about me, they already know. Where do I get evidence of actual innocence from?
Mhm,
The simple fact that the prosecutors were wrong don't matter.
mhm,
And you got to think about this too now.
mm.
When the state comes in this adversarial process, they're basically able to sit there and say reasons why you were guilty
Mhm.
should not have been exonerated. And in other words, they stand behind their story. They're not going to admit wrongdoing. They won't stop and say, you know what, my bad, we got this one wrong. In some cases, I've heard that happen where prosecutors or former
Mhm.
prosecutors have told the truth,
Right,
but
right.
they
Not
don't want to
not
do
always,
that.
and maybe not even
Exactly.
often. Wow.
So I got nothing. In fact, my petition was denied. It went before the second DCA to be reviewed. They didn't even write an opinion tonight. They just what they call per curiam affirm, PCA'd it. So
Hmm.
quick open and shut thing for them.
It's mind-blowing in a sense that they're willing to exonerate and release you and admit that, and yet not, and almost then put you on trial again for some kind of compensation and to kickstart almost that process again. To your point, making it adversarial, which is the way that the system approaches things anyway. Well,
Yeah,
Ron, one more question and then we'll start to
sure.
close out. One individual is asking, are you in contact with anybody on death row since you have left? Do you have any involvement with Florida's death row right now or individuals there?
Yeah, they have tablets now and are able to email, and
Mhm.
I've been able to stay in contact with a few of them, and even a couple who've had their sentences reduced to life without parole. In fact, one of those gentlemen just emailed me just recently, a week ago, and he actually said he wishes he was back on death row.
Mm.
That goes to the whole thing about that quote unquote ultimate punishment. A
Yeah.
lot of people don't know about that either, which is another good reason we shouldn't have a death penalty.
Wow.
But
Wow.
yeah, I do communicate with some of those guys from time to time. Some want books or
Mhm.
encyclopedias, or they just want to see how I'm doing and give themselves a hope of, glimmer of hope or something, because,
Mhm.
they're hearing about what I'm doing out here.
Well, Ron, two ways I know that people can support you in the work that you're doing is one, engaging Witness to Innocence. And
Mhm.
for those listening, I'll send out links to all these things that we'll talk about, but that organization and the work that you're doing through them. And then two, FADP, Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, specifically advocating for the repeal of the death penalty within Florida. I know you work with both of those groups, and you mentioned to me before we hopped on here that you want to direct people towards supporting those organizations because they are right in line with the work and the advocacy that you're doing.
That's correct. Witness to Innocence is basically an organization composed of death row exonerees and family members of death row exonerees. We've got members all across the United States, as well as a few overseas, one in particular who was exonerated in Florida that lives in Spain now.
Hmm.
We just got to visit with him last November when we went to Berlin for the 8th World Congress against the death penalty and spoke there. Um, the basic function of Witness to Innocence is to help and support these exonerees and empower these exonerees, for those that want to hear it, to get out, tell their stories, and share with people our problems with this broken system that
Mhm.
really I think is unfixable. As
Mm,
far as Floridians for the Alternatives to the Death Penalty, FADP.org,
mm,
their primary focus is focus on something other than executing someone in Florida, because we know a lot of people are guilty. They do deserve to be punished for their crimes and held accountable.
mm,
And a lot of them admit that. One of the other things we do is speak to private organizations, as well as go to law schools and talk to
mhm.
law students. We also go to the legislatures and do some lobbying in support or in
Mhm.
opposition to certain pieces of legislation. And we speak with the legislators and their staffs and, talk to them about these things just to help make that, impact on them,
Right.
to say, have you heard about this? Have you considered this? All these people out here, they have, they vote too, So that's pretty much the majority of the work we do there, doing speaking events to help people further understand and become aware of what they have just never heard, as well as trying to impact the changes in our state and local laws that are all directly involved in this and definitely have an impact, a great impact.
Right. Wow. Well, Ron, let me close out with a couple things. One, thank you, friend, for coming and sharing your story. I can't imagine the trauma that was there, and to share that and to be vulnerable with it and to bring people into that story. That is a true gift. So thank you for giving that to us, and thank you for continuing that work. And I know there are many on this call who want to support you, but thank you for being here and sharing this with us.
Well, like I said before, Sam, anytime I can, I will. Like right now, I'm not home. I'm sitting in the sleeper in my cab out here on the road in Illinois. So anytime
We had
I
a couple
can be
people
of
in the
help.
chat talk about the truck that you were in. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Well,
can
I
see
so
that.
appreciate it. I will send out to those listening and those who registered the recording of this, links to Witness to Innocence, links to FADP, and also want to tell people next month we'll be back. So on Thursday, April 27th, the next in the movement is going to be with Fox and Rob Richardson. And Rob Richardson is a man who was within prison for over 20 years in Angola, and he and his wife were married before and stayed together after, and now advocate for changes within our criminal legal system. They did an Oscar-nominated documentary called Time. They had a book come out recently, and we're going to have a conversation with them. And Ron, our goal, as it was here with you, is to engage and elevate these voices and have people, one, know and be aware, and then move into a place of advocacy. I always want people on that arc from awareness into advocacy. And thank you for the ways that you've equipped people. So Ron, again, I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much, Sam, for doing this, for helping share this information and spread this word. It's been a great help to a lot of people. And thank you for having me to help do it today.
Absolutely. And thank you to everybody who listens, and blessings on the rest of everyone's day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.